Hello and welcome, everyone. I'm going to be covering today what was covered on our Wednesday class for the Monday-Wednesday class. And for the Tuesday-Thursday class and the fully online class, note that this is done using a different tool than Zoom. And so it won't be transcribed. So let me know if that presents a problem for you. And what I'm going to focus on today is utilizing all the tools that we've learned thus far in this class to understand the articles and their discussion about the inflationary pressures that this latest stimulus package might create. And so the first question asks us to, in the writing assignment, use the supply and demand side formula for the US economy to define the meaning of an output gap and why it would lead to inflationary pressure. And so let us draw or write the two formulas side by side. So I'm going to have the demand side on the left and the supply side on the right. And remember what we're looking at. We're looking at the two different aspects of an economy of things and services. And so the demand side is categorizing what is bought or purchased. What and who, let me say this, what is bought and by whom I should say. So this is, if you remember, those letters. Take a second to think about what they were. So GDP, or gross domestic product, is made up of consumption spending, which is a function, remember, of interest rates and taxes. More on that in a second. Plus investment spending. Remember, in this context, we're looking at businesses borrowing money and investing in themselves, which also is a function of interest rates and taxes, plus government spending, plus the international sector, exports minus imports, or net exports. And so this is who is doing the buying, which is consumers, businesses, government, and then people overseas. And then how much they're buying of each thing. Now note, as we've seen in the past, that there's a relationship here between interest rates and consumption. There's a relationship between taxes and consumption. And I'm putting negative signs up there to show that when interest rates go up, then that makes borrowing money more expensive, and people tend to borrow less money and thus consume less with that borrowed money. In addition, taxes, if they go down, then people have more money to spend and so consume more, all other things equal. And the same holds true for investment. Interest rates, as they affect businesses borrowing, and taxes, if they affect money that businesses have to send to the government, have a negative relationship with the amount of investment spending. And so, as I've said in the past, this is equal, but I'm going to be more precise now. I'm going to put a tilde, a squiggly line that means approximately equal. And so recall that the supply side is made up of land, labor, and capital. So the amount of natural resources we have, the amount of humans we have to work, and the amount of equipment, tools, tech we have. And then this is modified by the kind of productivity or efficiency that we get from these things. So as we learn to use natural resources more efficiently in using of the sun to create power, that is more efficiently using the natural resources that we have around us. And so that is how productivity modifies land. Labor, it modifies by the skill level that people have. Capital depends on how much that tech is helping us make other things. And so this side is what is made. So what is made is bought, and what is bought is made. A pretty obvious relationship. Now, this is not always true that they're equal to one another, but there are always natural forces that move us back to the equilibrium of them being relatively equal. And so I'm going to show some inequalities here now. So I'm going to change that equal to let's say that the supply side is greater than the demand side. So what does that mean? That means there's more stuff on shelves than people are buying. We have a term for this. When the supply side is greater than the demand side, or our capability of producing is greater than our willingness to spend, we call this a negative GDP gap. So a gap between what's possible and what's bought, what's possibly made and what's possible to buy. Negative meaning we're stocking up. Store shelves are not being cleared. Factories are not selling what they make because there's not enough demand for those things. And so what this signifies is that there's less demand for things that are made. And this means that we are experiencing, so think about this, if less is being purchased, then on the supply side, especially having to do with labor, then those that produce things and sell things are going to need less labor because they don't need to make as many things. And so this leads to higher unemployment. And so I'll say, therefore, this raises unemployment. So this is what we're experiencing right now. We have a negative GDP gap. There is no worry about inflation with a negative GDP gap. If the economy is in recession, then what the Federal Reserve is focusing on is keeping interest rates low to try to stimulate our economy. And so what the articles talk about and the worry that's coming up now is that the inequality will be different soon. In fact, we'll have the opposite take place. That is, we'll have more demand than we have supply in our economy. We call this a positive GDP gap. And so what does this mean? This means that there is more demand for things and not enough to satisfy demand. So what does that mean? Think about this. If you own a business and you have your store shelves being emptied by a consistent rush of customers, well, one thing you can do is you can raise your prices because you don't have enough stuff, so may as well make a little more profit off of it and have the allocation or the distribution of goods go to those who have more money. Also, as you're getting more and more demand, you're having to use more and more resources, hire more and more people, buy more and more capital, and then maybe that's getting more expensive for you to make things. So you're going to have to pass along that higher expense to the customer. And so therefore, this raises, and I see that I wrote raising rather than raises above. So rather than unemployment, this raises inflation. And let me put this in quotes actually. This raises inflationary pressure. What that means is this is a way for economists to kind of hedge our bets. Like, it won't necessarily always lead to inflation. Maybe businesses are so happy to have customers after a long recession that they're not going to raise their prices. But it certainly raises the pressure knowing they can raise their prices, and if they want to make more profit, then they might just do that. And also, if more and more people are getting hired, more and more resources are being used on the supply side to make the things that the demand side is wanting, then eventually you're going to have to pay more and more to hire somebody because everyone's getting hired. You're going to have to compete for the available labor. And so what we're looking at here, so the next thing I want to do here for our notes, let's draw an X and a Y axis and remind ourselves something. So what I'm going to do here, business cycle. So recall with the business cycle, what we're measuring is the size of our economy our GDP, over time. And recall further that this rate of growth has a trend line. And that trend over the last 50, 60 years is that GDP has grown on average approximately 3% every year. But in reality, growth doesn't work like that. Sometimes we grow faster, sometimes we grow slower. And so this, let's see if I can do one that line here that's gonna let me do something different. There we go. Let's see how I can move this thing around. Maybe not. Bear with me, trying to use a different program than we normally use. I'm gonna do this. There we go. Sorry, got way too excited about that. All right. So sorry about that. So recall that as we grow too slow, right? So this is actual GDP, right? Actual GDP does not move in a straight fashion, sometimes too fast, sometimes too slow. Recall that what the Federal Reserve's job is to try to keep us within certain boundaries of growth, to not grow too fast and not grow too slow. And when we are growing, or in fact contracting, towards the trough or the low point, remember what the worry is and the target is that unemployment is trying to be kept to something that is less than 5%. And so in order to do that, remember, the Federal Reserve is going to lower interest rates. On the other end, up here, where we're growing really, really fast around a peak of the business cycle, then there's the opposite worry. And that is what the Fed tries to do is keep inflation, the rate of price increases in our entire economy, below 2% a year. And in order to slow the economy down, if we're getting to high levels of inflation, is to raise interest rates. And so what we're talking about here is that people are worried that, note what we've done. We've kept interest rates lower. We have, through the stimulus program, lowered people's taxes by sending them checks or gift cards, the stimulus checks, that offset the taxes they have to pay. Same with businesses. They're getting extra help from the government. And so note what that's going to do. That should cause consumption and investment to rise. And then also we've got all of this government spending as part of the stimulus package going into our economy. And so in a sense, what we're worried about is that this stimulus package works better than we need it to, that we overcorrect, that as we come out of this trough and get back to trend rate of growth, we start growing much faster. And that much faster then leads to an economy with high inflation. And so one thing that the stock market has done related to this is that when there have been worries about inflation, you see the stock market go down in value often. And what's happening there is that there's the worry that in the future, if we have high inflation, then the Federal Reserve is going to raise interest rates. And that people with money, not borrowing money, people holding on to money, might find it more attractive to take their funds out of the stock market and put them into just a simple savings account, a simple interest-bearing account, and get a higher rate of interest and not have to worry about a stock price fluctuating. And so in fact, when interest rates are higher, we tend to see lower stock market performance. And that's a worry that is related to people's wealth and class. Remember that inflation is not a friend of savers or people who are holding on to money. And it's not a friend to savers because inflation eats away at the value of your money over time. But also remember that inflation helps those of us that owe money because as prices rise year after year, the value of the money we're paying back to a bank or a lender is worth less than the money we received because inflation year after year eats away at the value of the dollar. So here we're really looking at, when you hear these concerns about inflation, is that those with money and have money in the stock market are worried that inflation is going to eat away at the value of their investments or the value of their money and draw people out of the stock market. And then people with debt are less worried. I mean, none of us who have debt like inflation at the grocery store, at the gas station, but in terms of paying off our debt, it's actually helpful to us. And so that's part of the reason why you're hearing, at least through the articles that I've had you read, more about this, that it is a struggle between those who are really hoping the economy recovers so they can get back to work and those who worry that it recovers too much so it eats away at the value of their money and lowers the value of the stock market. So hopefully you're getting a better idea of this output gap and how it can lead to inflation and how this relates to everything that we've been learning this semester. Let me go back to a writing prompt here. So number 2, if the recently enacted $1.9 trillion stimulus program does cause inflation to rise above 2% this year, is it a worthwhile sacrifice to achieve GDP growth and lowering the unemployment rate to below 5%? So we economists, we like to do what's called a cost-benefit analysis. So what I'm asking you to do is to, in writing, talk about the costs and the benefits here. So do the costs, higher inflation in society, exceed the benefits of lower unemployment? This is how economists like to analyze the situation about what should be done. Are the benefits going to outweigh the costs? So please try to explain your personal opinion in detail regarding what is your cost-benefit analysis. How does this strike you as either a worthwhile gamble to definitely get us out of this recession and lower unemployment down to where just about anyone who wants to find a job can find a job, and that's worth the cost of inflation? Or your justification that no, we don't need to do that because I don't want to see inflation like it was in the past. And so you don't really have an experience with high inflation, most of you, given your age. When I was a boy growing up in San Francisco in the 1970s and early 80s, inflation was running at about 10% a year. Gas had exploded in price. People were really being hurt by this inflation. And so the Federal Reserve decided we are going to bring inflation down by raising interest rates really, really high. But note what that does. That makes borrowing really, really expensive. Essentially, what the Federal Reserve is tasked to do when the economy is growing too fast is cause a recession. And that's what they did during parts of my childhood, cause a recession to try to bring inflation under control. So in the last part here, if inflation does begin to rise and stay above 2%, how will higher interest rates the Fed will enact affect you? And so today, being our second lecture, what I'd say in this regard is that, well, you might say in number 2, your cost-benefit analysis weighs towards, let's get unemployment down, and that's going to be worth it, even if we have to deal with higher unemployment. Higher interest rates to fight inflation. Note that if this happens in the next year or so, and we start to grow so fast, prices starting to rise, the Fed could raise interest rates really high to make it such that when you graduate in a couple of years from a four-year university, if you choose to, you might be graduating into a recession that the Federal Reserve is creating in order to slow the economy down because it got overheated. And what that would also mean is, not only would it be harder to find a job, but it would also mean that if you do find a job, the interest rate you're going to have to pay if you buy a car on credit or a home on credit will be so high that you might not qualify for the amount of money that you truly want to borrow to buy the car or house. So it's going to limit the possibilities in terms of what you're capable of doing. So I want you to analyze, and please excuse the phone there. I want you to analyze this from a couple of different perspectives, from the supply and demand side formula in terms of costs and benefit, and then take it as true that this does cause inflation. We get this recession taken care of, but then there is such high inflation that the Fed raises interest rates, and how will that affect you in the coming years? There's no easy answer here. In my opinion, this is worth the risk, because the risk of staying in a recession with people unemployed, I think, far outweighs the costs of possible inflation. If that happens, and the Fed can get it under control. So more on the Fed's capabilities in another class.